So, my name is Howland Chipman. Many times I think everything that we do and everything that we have is by God's providence, isn't it? My life truly is by God's providence. My father, really, by all rights, should not have survived the passage here on the ship Mayflower. You know, he was here as a servant to the good Master Carver. He was our governor and was a very good man in the church in Leiden that they were in. But he died after he got here. But my father was a servant to that man, John Carver, which is a great opportunity. To be a servant to someone it is not a low thing, it is a goodly thing. It is a way that you prepare to be an adult, a way that you receive opportunities to improve your life. In the time that I live, most people do not go to university or college, and so the way to improve your skills is to become a servant or an apprentice to someone. So my father did that, but on the way, he was above boards, and I never knew why. He was above boards on that ship, and with a great seal of the ship, he was thrown overboard. And really, it was the middle of the ocean, the cold, cold water. They say he was sundry fathoms deep, but there was a topsail halyard in the water. That's a line from one of the sails, which should not be in the water at all. Those lines are always fastened up tight, aren't they, so we know where they are. Yeah, dragging in the water it was, and he fell in the water right where it was dragging in the water. Sundry fathoms deep, but he got hold of that line and he pulled himself up as far as he could, and he had his consciousness, right? Which is also remarkable after a long fall into the cold water. And then the sailors had seen him go, and they used a great hook and they pulled him up on board, and he was not well with it for some time after, but he survived. And everyone says that that's a sign that God favored him greatly, and therefore favored all who came after him greatly. And otherwise God would not have preserved him in that way. And he was preserved well enough that he was part of a party that explored Cape Cod when we arrived here, our people. He explored Cape Cod, he found Plymouth as a place to live. He was part of all of those expeditions, so he must have been feeling well enough by then, right? And we lived in Plymouth. When I was born, Plymouth was a very small, contained place, and it had been a company of sorts where people were hoping to own land. And just when I was born was when people began to receive their land and to expand and start their farms and get their properties. And so my father was very involved in the government of the town. And until I remember when I had 5 years to me, and my father was different. Something had changed. I only learned when I was an adult what had happened. My father was responsible for the fur trade. Do you know about the fur trade? So the reason that the fur trade is so important for us is because it is one of the most valuable things that you can get here and bring back home and sell. There's a great profit to it, always has been for us. Certainly it was an inflated price for a while and it's gone down a bit, but it's still a great profit. And so not only is it good for us, but it is good for anyone else who can do it. So there's often competition, and my father was responsible for going forth and back. He had actually a pinnace, I think, that he named Elizabeth Tilley, or my mother. But he'd had a boat that he would go back and forth, so he was responsible for the trade. And it became very competitive. I was about 5 years old, and he was in Maine, and Plymouth Colony had fishing rights up until about where on the Kennebec River the tide does not influence the river no more. That was all our area. And another fella had brought his ship there and anchored it and was going to begin to intercept the trade for the colony. So my father said, well, why don't we go and cut his anchor lines? So we put 2 men in a wee canoe And they went out and they cut one anchor line, but it was too difficult to keep the boat up to the line, right, and cut it. So they come back, and he sent another man, Moses Fletcher, the third man to go on that boat, and they went out and they went to cut the second anchor line so that this ship would drift out. And the man who was in charge came out with a gun, and another man held a gun to Moses Fletcher's head. And my father said, "Stop, take me, because I am the head of this. Anything that this man does is for me. If there's any cause for offense, I am the one who was given offense. Please take my life, do not take this man's life." And he shot him right in the head, Moses Fletcher, right next to his head. My father had never seen anything like it. And then someone from our pinnace shot one of theirs, and then my father said, stop the shooting. But after that, Massachusetts Bay at that time it was separate from the colony. Massachusetts Bay had a separate government, and they were very offended by my father's actions, very offended. So he became very much out of favor. He stopped being able to serve as public office. He was very sad, and he received a lot of abuse for being blamed for that event. But I feel that my father saved everyone else's lives there. But about 10 years old I was, and my father got land in Rocky Nook. Right? So we had ground for planting corn that was right by the brook. There's a brook for our mill, and we had ground right there. But this fella, John Jenny, wants to start a mill, and he needs land on the brook. And he had land up at Rocky Nook, so my father sold him our land, and part of it was getting Rocky Nook. So that's where I lived a good part of my life. And by the time we were up there, things seemed better for my father. You know, he was more involved in government again, and things had settled down a bit. I think perhaps not being near the center of town helped also, you know. So, and then when I had 17 years, then I met my husband. He also is named John Chipman. And he was a carpenter. And he had been here in the New World, and then he had gone back to England because there was some challenge to his land that he had in England. He had to go sign papers. He went back for 2 years and came back here. That is not an easy thing. I don't know if any of you have ever crossed, but that is not an easy thing to go back and forth. It's a good 2-3 months to do that. And so it was a remarkable journey for him. And he was gone for 2 years and he come back. And after he come back, he caught my eye and my father his eye. And we were wed. I had about 17 years when we were wed. And we come to Barnstable. I had about 21 years. I had one child, Elizabeth. My husband fared very well here. You know, it is a beautiful place. It is, in fact, the way that this place looks, I've never been in England, but they say it looks just like Barnstable in England, that there's all of this shallow beach and sand, wondrous for salt hay. There's so many things that this place has that the rest of the colony needs. And so it was with great joy, really, that we come to live here. And I feel so very grateful because my father continuously increased his holdings, and now my husband has been doing the same, because we are aware that we are not only retaining land for ourselves, but for our progeny, that our children will need to have land. And if we want them to have enough land, this is the moment to acquire as much of it as possible. And so we have done very well here. After a time, we moved to Great Marshes and we got a place there. And that's where most of the children were born and have been raised. And it has been a good life. The reason that our church came here had to do with some dissent. Our churches are congregational. Do you know about that? The reason they are congregational is because we believe that Scripture tells us that only Christ is the head of the church. And if we are to do as God wishes, we must have a church which has covenanted together It is agreed that they believe in the same things. And so we all are covenanted into the church. I was covenanted in about 1650 and my husband 2 years later. And that is often the case, that women are accepted into the covenant before men. It is not uncommon at all for the woman. And then after the woman, one of them has been taken into the covenant, the children can be baptized in the church. But we cannot baptize children whose parents are not part of the covenant. So we covenanted with the church, and I said my husband's was accepted 2 years later, but the church that came here as a result of dissent. It's so unfortunate, so many churches do. But the blessing of being part of Plymouth Colony and not part of Massachusetts Bay is that people such as us do not kill other people for their beliefs, right? So there have been folks who have been here longer than I have called Quakers. And it is not our way, and it is not really legal to be a Quaker. And my husband was put on a committee of men who were charged with going to Quaker meetings, but not to pull them out. Boston in Massachusetts Bay executes them, but to try to convince them of the error of their ways. So we certainly think it's wrong, but we are not making it a legal matter. Does that make sense? My sister went to live in Rehoboth. She married a man named James Brown, and she knew him through the fur trade again. Thomas Willett. Thomas Willett was the man who got New Amsterdam back for us. That's happened, I'm glad to say. New Amsterdam is where my father initially intended to land. That was the property where they were going to live. And then who ended up living there? The Dutch. But we've got it back now. So he was involved in that reclaiming of it. So my sister has married James Brown, and they have gotten into a controversy in their church in Rehoboth over baptism. So we believe that people should be baptized as infants, and people who believe that we baptize adults are, we think, heretical, right? So there was a fella who was a pastor in their church who was a Baptist, but he was a sneaky Baptist because he was allowing folk from the other church to be a part of his church without committing to the baptism part. Isn't that clever? Just pull them all in and then you've got them, right? So he convinced a great lot of people who did not believe in adult baptism to come into that church, and it became a great problem for the primary church. And of course, my sister, her husband, was part of that Baptist group. So the town made an agreement. They said, you people can have your church, you're going to go over to that side of the river, and you're not going to take any of our members anymore, but you can have your church and do whatever you want. And that's Swansea. That's where my sister is. And actually, my mother is living with her now in Swansea. For a while, my mother was living with Jabez down in Plymouth, where we were originally. He's still got a house down there, but now she's living with Lydia, which is good. They all get along very well, and my mother is very happy there. But it is a remarkable thing. I think one would often think that people like myself have very similar beliefs and similar outlooks. And it is not true. Is anyone here a member of a congregational church? So some of you know, is it easy? Do you all agree all the time? No. And it's true in all of these communities. But one of the great blessings, especially of Cape Cod and of Plymouth Colony, is that we are pretty tolerant of people who are different. We tell them that they're wrong, but we let them keep doing what they're doing. So there was a terrible war that just ended, because it's now 1679. I have 50 years to me now. There was a great, terrible war between the natives and the English. But people here on Cape Cod, we have a good relationship with the local people. Master Bourne has done a remarkable job. There's some very good praying towns here, and they are friendly enough to us here that none of us were involved in that war. So that is a great blessing. And another reason I think that all of us would say, we are very glad we don't live in Boston. I think anyone who lives here would say that. There's a reason I'm not living in Boston and I'm living here, and that's one of them, I will say. We're even saying that in our time, I will tell you. I'm going to live here instead of Boston. It's a good idea. But my children fared very well here, and my husband and I fared very well here. My husband has acquired more land. As I said, we got great marshes, so there's a great lot of property here that the Chipman family owns, which gladdens my husband's heart so much because now he will be able to have something to give to our children. And 3 of our girls have married now. Elizabeth and Hope and Lydia, my 3 first girls, have all married, and they've married well. We've got 10 children altogether, and only lost one. We had a boy that we lost the same year he was born. That was our first John. But now we had another boy many years later, and he's the John who we've got now. So he's faring very well. But my father and mother had 10 children and did not lose anyone of them at all. And I've had 11 and only lost one. So we are, as I said, it is really a work of God that our family has fared as well as it has. It is a true God's providence, I believe, truly. So the other remarkable descent that has happened between England and the other countries is, when we first came here in Plymouth to start a colony, we were always worried about Dutch and Spanish because Spanish are brutal. And at the time that my father's group was to come here, they were discussing where they would go, and one of the places they thought they might settle is Guyana. But one of the chiefest reasons not to was the Spanish, and that it was so close to the Spanish and we would not be able to defend ourselves against the Spanish. And so we ended up here, but the Dutch have become a problem, and the Dutch have been a problem for England for a long time, especially in the colonies. And there have been a number of wars, mostly naval wars. They're fighting in the oceans. And the first conflict we handily won, but the second one has just ended, and England did not fare well. And so the Dutch have taken a great lot of control, and we are quite concerned about the Dutch taking Barnstable. So we have got a special militia, and my husband is on that special militia, his primary work is to make sure that our colonies and our towns are not taken over by the Dutch. We had, when we were living my sister is very close to them. And now, thank God that we've got New Amsterdam back. That is a big difference. But a lot of the conflict with the Dutch has happened farther down near Swansea and Rehoboth and places like that. So my father has died. My father died less than 10 years ago. And all of us have married well into property or have acquired property. And very grateful for it, are we? My mother, as I said, she hath 80-ish years, and she is with my sister in Swansea. So, is there anything you are wondering about your town or your family that I might be able to answer for you? Anything you're wondering? Yeah.
Talk more about the Plymouth versus Boston politics.
So, this might be a long response, is that all right?
Yeah,
Stop me. If it becomes tedious, stop me. Because this is very interesting to me. So part of the Reformation in England was that there were a lot of people who believed that the Bible is the pure truth. Right? And those were separatists and Puritans. The difference was that Puritans were willing to have a congregational way in their congregation, but remain under the ecclesiastical structure of the English church, which to someone like my neighbors was heresy. You can't have a congregational way when you're under the king. You've got to remove yourself from under that to have a true congregational church if you're truly looking to do God's will and follow Christ's word. So the chiefest difference between the Puritan and the separatist was this willingness of the Puritans to remain under the structure of the church. And as a result, when they came here to the New World, they were suddenly functioning outside of the structure of the church. In essence, they had to consider how to operate as separatists. And as a result, they came to Plymouth. They came to Plymouth a number of times to experience worship, and to sit down and talk to the people at Plymouth about how they have organized their government and their church, and how the structure of their church is, what offices we have in the church, and we only have offices that are found in Scripture. So there's no bishops or that sort of thing, but we've got elders and deacons and that sort of thing is what we've got in our church. And so they came to learn about that structure, and then they went back to Massachusetts Bay. But I will tell you, that is a good harbor. It's an excellent harbor. It's goodly deep, and they came because they were still essentially in league with the King's Church. They were very financially successful. So whereas my family and my neighbors were quite poor when they came here, these people were wealthy. They just packed up bricks and horses and started a city, is what they did. Whereas my people, we scrapped and scraped for so long, but they were, right away, they had a very strong community. And so pretty early on, they were more powerful than we were in many ways. And we have worked, the governor had worked very hard to keep as many things in Plymouth Colony, in Plymouth as possible, but as time goes on, many things are reverting back to Massachusetts Bay. It's very unfortunate. And it looks like Massachusetts Bay will take all of it. There might be satellite colonies that become part of Massachusetts Bay, but it's essentially the center of Plymouth now is, my brother lives there, but there's no center of business there anymore. There's no center of judiciary there anymore. Most of what's happening is happening in Mass Bay. So the thing that is very different about the leadership of Massachusetts Bay is that we have been very careful not to align church membership with community participation. Right? So you can be a civic leader without being a covenanted member of the church. Plymouth Colony could never have survived if they didn't do that, because half of them on that first ship were not from the church at all. So we have never made faith in God or proper worship what's the word I'm looking for? Something that you have to have before you can become a citizen or a magistrate or own land or anything. Massachusetts Bay, you've got to be in league with the church and in good terms with the church in order to have any sort of public position. And they are pretty clear that they do not advocate, they try to separate state and church, but I will tell you that that they funded the church that they started in Rehoboth. So in Massachusetts Bay, the lines between church and state are very thin, if any. And Plymouth Colony is much stronger in dividing the requirement for being in good league with the church to be considered in good league with the community. And I could probably say more about that later. Yes?
Well, can you tell us what it's like in your town of Barnstable, what the landscape looks like and what your home looks like, and also you had a tavern. Can you tell us?
No, I didn't. I believe my son talks about maybe one day doing that. Which I don't know what I think about that, but you've got to have a tavern, right? I mean, there's got to be a place for hospitality. Yeah, doesn't that make sense? There has to be a place, especially if you're traveling. There's no place to refresh yourself here. There must be an inn or a tavern. He just is going to have to be careful about, Master Hopkins in our town, he got into great trouble for serving alcohol on the Sabbath. And he was thrown in jail a couple of times. So if he does that, I will have to keep reminding him. So as I said, here, we have cleared so much of this place, cut down the trees so that we can have farms. So this place is not the place that it was when we first came here, certainly. We have cleared as much land as possible for farming, and we are also trying to harvest as much hay as possible, although when English first came here, salt hay was quite suspicious. Salt hay has been a very important product that we have been able to create and send out to other places. Praise God for that. But I would say just the expanses of sand here are unlike anything else in New England, like unto Barnstable in England. But it's a beautiful place that I find to be peaceful. And I wouldn't want to be in Plymouth Central or in Boston at any rate. So the house that we just built is a high single house, and there's a lean-to on it, and the lean-to is where the kitchen is. So typically we would build a separate, it's very wise to have your kitchen sort of in the back of most of your living space, because where are we most likely to have a fire? Kitchen. So the lean-to on our house is where the kitchen is. And it's really the first time we've had a big enough house for all of the children, which is very good. Mostly in our homes, our front rooms are the public rooms. So often the master and mistress's bedroom is in the front of the house, but that is also where company is received. So that was the case for Reverend Lothrop, although his living quarters were behind where we were worshiping. The front house was the public part of his house. The part of your house that is never public is the kitchen. That is behind. And my mother says that when we first started the town in Plymouth, that it was pretty remarkable because their houses, the kitchens were included in the rest of the house, right? It was one room essentially, 1 or 2 rooms. So any of the men's conversations that were happening, my mother was privy to because it's one room. Now it's different because we are in the kitchen, which is actually a separate structure from the main house. So we don't get as much information as my mother used to get. Women don't, but that is, and our houses have got, there are interesting practices that we have at this time that would possibly surprise you. Like we have to produce ammonia for cleaning. So you can imagine the best product to use to produce ammonia is our own urine. So there's often urine in the kitchen becoming ammonia. You know, it's just not a place where the public should be. But many of us who own a great lot of land, we do have servants and people in the house who help us. So if you're a head of a house, it's a bit different because you've got to keep everybody on track, you know, keep the dairying people on track and keep the people who are cooking on track and that sort of thing. So running a house that is a big household with a great lot of land is a bit like running a business. So that women are excellent businessmen. You know, women are considered to be deputy husbands, that anything your husband can do, you can do. You don't have the legal authority to, but you can do it in his name. But there is an interesting case of my neighbor, Mistress Warren, in Plymouth. Elizabeth Warren was her name. So she had all girls. She had all these girls, and her husband died before they were of marriageable age. And so Elizabeth Warren was able to legally finish a lot of the legal things that her husband had started, finish them in his name. That's not very unusual. What was unusual was that she retained control of all of their property so that when their children were getting married, she was able to control who got property and when, according to how they were behaving. So her sons-in-law stepped right into line. Now, her oldest son sued her because in England, there's a practice called primogeniture, which means the oldest son gets all of the property of the father. He sued her and said she should not have the property. I should have all of the property. And he lost because Plymouth does not have primogeniture, which is quite a remarkable thing. I mean, I know that in Massachusetts Bay, women are being quite, should I say squashed? Squashed. But it's a bit different out here. I think if we become part of the Massachusetts Bay government, that will make a great difference. But women have more power than you might think right now. But in general, women are more capable than you would think because women can do just about anything that her husband does. So if their husband isn't there, they're running the house, they're running the business, they're running the property, just as their husband would, possibly better. I don't want to sound too proud because that would be sinful. And I don't want the governor or my husband hearing that, do I? But does that make sense? And did I answer your question well about Puritan versus separatist in Massachusetts?
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are there Quakers and Sandwiches? What's your relationship?
Well, my husband is to go to those meetings. There are 3 or 4 men who have been charged not to roust them and hurt them, but to go to them and try to convince them of the error of their ways. It is a kind thing that we're doing. So that's what we're doing, is we are going there, and my husband is going to their meetings and convincing them of the benefits of our way of worship, and really that we are right and they are wrong. But not to hurt them, but to convince them, to help them so that they can change their thinking to ours. Which is, I know, for your time, somewhat oppressive, but it is far better than hanging them, isn't it? It's a big difference, I think. Big difference. So I'm rather proud of that, I think. Although I shouldn't be proud, I know, but I will admit that I am. I think that that's a big difference. Cape Cod is remarkable for that also, I think.
How big a population is that Quaker population relative to yours?
Much smaller. They are growing, but much smaller. And as of right now, they are not as big as they will become, as of right now in my life, right? They will become bigger, but it is because they're tolerated that they can come here. That is why they are growing, and they will continue to grow, because we are not people who will roust them and hurt them. We will annoy them by telling them they're wrong, apparently, but we won't hurt them. So they will grow here, and that is a good thing, you know? God does not wish us to force people to do anything. Someone said, I think it was Master Williams, that enforced worship stinks in God's nostrils. God does not want people in the pew because you threw them there and tied them down, does he? Hey, yeah, go ahead.
What is Reverend John Mosley?
He's a strong-minded person. And he's got a good family, he's got a few children, he doesn't have as many as we do. We are so blessed, remarkably so. And he is also very future-thinking. He is a man who is not only wise with theology, but he is wise in political thinking. He really is. I mean, he created a situation. It took him a long time to remove from Scituate. And the reason that he could, I think, is because he was so wise. He was wise enough to see the need for his congregation to be able to expand, to have more land. And he was wise to see that politically the congregation would never succeed in Scituate. And he positioned us so remarkably well, so that those of us who are coming, it was a very wise choice to begin this community. And it was well done when he did it. So he's a strong man, he's forward-thinking, and he is a good family man. And it is quite a thing that we've built a meeting house. You know, we don't build a church, we build a meeting house. You know the difference, right? The church is the people. So that back, I would say, when Master Brewster was a boy, you know, the man who was the elder of our church in Plymouth, when he was a boy, they were translating the Bible into English, and the big change that happened is there's a word, ecclesia, which always meant church, which meant the church government, the church structure, the church building, and this meant congregation. Ecclesia meant people. So that is the great difference between us and other churches, churches of England and that sort of thing, is that our houses are houses for meeting, but they are not churches. We are the church. So it is quite remarkable, though, that our parish has grown so very much that we already built another meeting house, and I wonder if it won't be too small pretty soon. We might have to do something else. I mean, Barnstable is growing enough that it could become 2 parishes at some point. It's remarkable how successful we are here. It's a very successful colony. And again, that is, I think, speaks to Reverend Lothrop, if that makes sense. Yes?
What are the businesses that are here? And also, do you have a school?
That's a good question. There are schools in Boston. I know that there is a university, Harvard University, and that there is a school there because grammar schools teach Latin. So there is a Latin school in Boston. I know that. But I am not certain that there are any proper schools here. We have dame schools. We have schools where we teach children to read and the Bible and that sort of thing. Schools where it's not very expensive. It's not the same as grammar school where you're learning Latin. I believe everyone is going to Boston for grammar school, but I'm not certain about that. That's a good question. I'll find out the answer for that for you. Thank you. Sorry about that I'm not certain. I can't say certainly. Yes?
I have a domestic question.
All right.
I understand that you drink beer instead of water.
Well, We don't have to here, but we did for generations, yes. But the blessing of that is that beer is nutritious. Water is empty, is devoid of nutrition.
The question is, how much beer do people drinking really buzzed all day long?
Good question. So I think that it's difficult to understand that in my time, we are brewing our own beer. We are not going out and purchasing beer that has already been brewed. So we control the strength of the brew. So there's something called small beer, and that's what you make for your families. Certainly, if my son does have a tavern, they will be brewing something strong for the tavern because that's where the men are going to go and want stronger beer. But the purpose of brewing beer is not to make your mind go loopy. The purpose of beer is to have something that's safe to drink because there is so many foul things in the water in Europe and England that the water's not safe. If you drink it, you will die. Because once you drink it, you're infected by it and you can't get better from it. So if you think about giving your children beer or giving your children poison, it's an easy choice, right? Beer it is. But we brew our own beer, so we do not brew strong beer. We brew beer that is, and we believe that anything in excess will make you drunk. Too much water will make you drunk. Smoking too much will make you drunk. You know, that everything in moderation is acceptable, is how we feel health-wise. So that's a good question. So we brew our own beer and we brew it properly for its purpose. But beer is like bread. It was very stressful for us. My mother was bringing us up. She was very upset to not have beer. She was surprised at how healthy we were. She said that because we were eating cold fish, right? Hard-grained bread, spring water. That'll kill you, that diet, right? And no beef, no beer, no cheese. But we fared well. Again, God's providence, right? God willed us to do so well with that poor diet. But now we do have beer because we are able to brew it. We are able to either grow barley or get barley. So the beer situation has improved. You'll be relieved to know. Yes, I am relieved to know. Does that make sense? Did you have a question? No? Anyone else? Yay.
I understand that you have an orchard on where you live in West Barnstable. Did you make cider?
Yes, actually, that's a very English thing to do. But cider, you make cider and you ferment it. You don't just make cider and drink it. You make cider and ferment it, and then you have it. So orchards are a very important part of our lives. We were not able to have orchards really until we had our own land because it's a great responsibility. So people have brought bees over to pollinate their orchards because we didn't have bees here. So people are bringing bees over on ships. There were bees that would sting you, but not bees that would make honey. So still, we're mostly using tallow candles because there's almost no beeswax here. So that is a challenge with an orchard is finding something other than bees. There are certainly other things here, but we prefer honeybees for many reasons. So we're hoping that, more and more people will have honeybees and that they will become more common here. But many households have brought hives over from England for that reason. What's the use of a bee that stings you? Why would God create that? Yeah, so, but yes, orchards are an important part of our lives. And that's another piece of being here is that, yes, this place is covered with trees, but they're not useful trees. We cut down those trees, use them, and then put things like orchards in their place, and that is useful. That tree is useful. God wants us to multiply, be fruitful and multiply, and that does not mean let a forest grow until trees were obscenely large that 5 men can't get their hands around. That's not what God wants us to do, right? And so we have been improving the land bit by bit. It's a long process of civilization. It is still a fairly wild place, but Cape Cod is unusual also because the native people here have good relations with us. We do not have many problems with them, and they do not have many problems with us, in our opinion. Maybe another perspective on that, but I don't know about it. Anyone else? Yay.
Yarmouth, Dennis, Brewster, what exists?
Ooh, good question. Yarmouth, certainly. Barnstable, Sandwich.
Okay.
And then I think a lot of places still have native names. I am not sure that anything else in 1679. Do you know, mistress, of other town names in 1679? Mashpee, but it's not a town, but it's a place that we know. Perhaps.
Do you call Mashpee Mashpee?
Yeah, we call many places by the native names, yes. We still have retained many native place names.
Walk Mashpee, Walk White, both.
Well, there are some places that we're using both and some places that we're still using native. And part of that is because it's easier. It's easier if we know one thing. When you change the name of it, there are so many people who need to know you changed the name of it, you know what I mean? So part of it is, unless it had a name originally when we originally planted here, it doesn't right away. This place had a native name and it was renamed because it reminded people of Barnstable in England. That's why this place got its name. And I think once a place is heavily settled and sort of becomes a town or a village or a community, that's when the name will change. I can answer that better probably in about 30 minutes. It's a really good question. But I know Sandwich, I know Yarmouth, and I think eventually some towns break off, you know, and split and become, possibly, Dennis, I'm not sure about that. I'll find out, I'll answer that again. And I can confer with the ultimate wisdom we all have at our fingertips. Yes?
Can you speak of the weather here in Barnstable and how your seasons are planned around the weather and storms off the sea?
It's improving here. When I was a child, the weather was quite fierce. It was very cold in the winter. It was very hot in the summer, and it is tempered now that I'm an adult. It has tempered a bit. It's not as tempered as England. And we are hard hit when there are storms, yes. And I would say we are hoping that the more that we civilize the place, the more we cut down the trees and properly care for the earth so that the sun can strike the earth and then warm us, right? That it will be warmer here. Really, this should be like Portugal. We are on the same parallel as Portugal, but obviously we have not civilized the place enough to be that warm. But it will be, we hope. Yeah. So it's difficult to tell in your time because our standard for good weather is England. It's very difficult to tell. But yes, there are big storms here. There are storms that are damaging. And the winter is cold, but in the time of my father's arrival, it was worse. This area is coming out of a very cold time when we come here. It's the end of a very cold time. It's a mini ice age is what they would call it. Okay, so the climate is changing generation to generation. So it has improved, but yes, as you can imagine, I don't think that has changed much. And to be farther inland is safer. And that's what the natives knew also. They always had their winter homes farther inland, always. They had them sometimes a mile or two from the shore. They would live on the shore in the summer and the spring, do their planting, and then they would abandon that house, take the coverings off of it, and move inland 1 or 2 miles to live with the family group, with their, believe it or not, there's a woman at the head of it. They think the woman's the head of the house. Poor people. They're such children. But, does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, yes. Sorry.
Oh, do you and your neighbors, do you do much fishing and you prepare the cod and use that as a source of fishing?
Yeah, this place, you know that it was not named Cape Cod originally. It was named Cape James because King James was the king. So that northerly Cape was Cape Anne because she was the queen. And the river betwixt them was the Charles because he was their son. But this place could not retain the name of James because of the cod. This place is remarkable for cod. There are people who say you can walk on the backs of them, but that's not true. I've never seen that. People love to it. Sometimes people say that the sky is black with geese. Never seen that either. But it's a way to say this place is full of abundance. And there's not only cod that we've got here. We've got everything. We've got hake and bass and trout. I never knew there were so many fish as I know that there are now. But yes, we do prepare them, so the men catch them, and we prepare them. So I favor grilling them. I've got a griddle. It's a grid, and it's made out of cast iron, and I put it on the coals, and I clean the fish and open it up and lay it flat, and it grills, and that's the best. I think that's the best way to cook them. They're wonderful. But we also still are salting some and sending them back. We are producing salt here. That's another business that people have here, is salt makers. This is the best place for salt making, I think. They tried to do it in Plymouth and they really failed. But here is much better. It's very well suited because of, as I said, all of these stretches of sand and low water. It's perfect. So what were you wondering about? Is that what you were wondering about essentially?
Yes, I was wondering if fish was a large part of your diet.
It is. Not as much as it was when I was a child. When I was a child, we had very little else, but now we are settled enough that we are able to preserve things for the winter. So it's a bit more like England in that way, that we have more foods that are preserved for longer times, and we do have more variety. But fish, how can you not eat fish here? Right? So yes, it is a big part of our diet. The thing that we still do not think is a wise thing to eat, you can eat it, but it's not preferable, is lobster. They're very cloying, and they don't really give you nutrition. They're not a proper meal. So when I was a child, the pigs used to eat the lobsters. So we don't bother with them. Mussels we like, clams, oysters, but we do like mussels. It's very peculiar, isn't it? What standards people have. Yes?
When the land was cleared, were certain trees off limits because they were so big and England wanted them? Or did that happen later?
No, the big trees, we cut them down and sent them back. What are you thinking about that I'm not hearing?
King Philip's pines, were those later on that were forbidden anything over 23 inches?
Yes, I think that was later because we took as many of the trees as possible early on and sent them back. I think that is the second generation of trees that are starting to grow. What year was that you're thinking of?
Well, maybe 1700.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is the next century. It's a good question. I'm pretty sure it is, though. Anything else you're wondering about? Yes?
How often do you and members of your household travel about and visit friends or go not to Boston but back to Plymouth?
Yeah, back to Plymouth. We do go back to
Do
Plymouth.
such things?
Yeah, and it's easier actually now to bring my mother to us than to bring us to my mother. But we have done that. We do travel to see Jabez, and we did travel to see my parents when they were still in Plymouth. I do not travel often to Swansea, but people do travel. From up in Maine, they travel down to Martha's Vineyard to visit family. So there is quite a bit of traveling. People do travel to visit one another, and they do talk about it, they write about it. And that is sort of surprising, Maine to Martha's Vineyard, but people do it.
Are you traveling on by ship or by wagon?
You need to do both usually. There aren't really bridges. So it is challenging to come off of Cape Cod. But it can be done on land. There are two bodies of water that some people do use a canoe to go across. Some people do. We have portage, so it's sort of, there are canoes that are sort of always there. And you leave them behind, and then when you come back, you use them, and then you leave them behind. So there are some problems with the natives of my neighbors. They say they're stealing the boats, that they take their boats because they're so good at making those. They call them meshoon, but we call them canoe. So we do sometimes need to use canoes to get across places where there are no bridges. But it is mostly walking. The easiest way to go from Plymouth to here is by boat. Across the harbor is the easiest way and the fastest way. So that when I was a child and there was an emergency, there was a boy that was lost, the Billington boy was lost, and he was way out on Cape Cod, way out where they had found the corn, is where the natives had brought him, and the people from Plymouth came on a boat to get him. That is the fastest way, and the most sure way. Anything else? Should I become someone else? So I can find out what time it is. What time is it now? Oh, good, all right. I'm Vicki Oman. Again, it was really fun to think about Hope, Howland, Chipman. I'm really glad that you asked me to do it. And there are some things that I don't know. I didn't quite know the answer to your question, and I didn't quite know the answer to your question, but I bet we can Google it. What I do is I Google it, and then I check to make sure what I found is a proper source. You know, you can weed it out after you Google it. There are some, someone sent me the Chipman genealogy, and that was a very helpful document, and there are actually other scholars who refer to that genealogy, by John Hale, I think, as a very well-written genealogy, that's pretty much all correct. Is that you? Thank you. It was very helpful, and I looked at Eugene Stratton, and he refers back to that as a very good source. The only conflict that I found in Hale is that he says that Chipman was part of that group who were persuading Quakers, and another source says that he wasn't, but I'm pretty sure that he was. I don't know, I wasn't there though, so. And I wish I could answer more about the town. So I do not know about which towns are named. That's a really good question. And I'm really not entirely sure about the climate, but I do know that they talk about storms, fierce storms with winds, and that it was an ice age when the Pilgrims got here. It was the tail end of an ice age. And so it was getting warmer and warmer all the time, so that really the second generation had a better climate, and the next generation had a better climate. But it never got to be like Portugal. Oh well. They didn't understand the currents. Yes. Gulf Stream.
In 1683.
Yep.
And the taverns I moved to,
I think it was the son. Am I wrong about that?
her husband had them, but Rick over here, he is the expert on it.
Was it the son or was it the father who had a tavern?
There were two taverns.
They had it at 2 times. First one being West Barnstable. I think he ran it, maybe the son began up when they moved into, what was it, Barnstable? Second move.
Barnstable was first, and then...
And then West, yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. It would have been Barnstable, then
The
West.
son did
I didn't find a record of the first tavern. I found a record of the second one, but I did not find a record of the first one, so I don't like to talk about it if I don't know, but you probably know more than I do.
I've been pursuing it
For years, yeah. So I don't know about that.
There was a description of the stagecoach coming
Right.
and stopping at the Chipman Tavern, and we're not sure if it's the Barnstable or the West Barnstable.
That would have been the later one, because I don't think there were stagecoaches yet when I was alive,
You were.
I believe.
Yeah, that's...
So yeah, when I die, John marries again, and the only children he has are Howlands. So all the children are Howlands. He married again, she died, and then he married Bourne's widow, which I think was really smart. He must have had so much land. That was so smart. Because then all that land he could give to his children, like he didn't have children with her, so that was brilliant. So anyway, he ends up buried. She's buried, she has her husband, Bourne was her third husband. She was Sergeant Winslow Bourne Chipman. Black widow, huh? So he's buried, and then she buried John Chipman, and then she was buried between them. So I'm all by my lonesome here in Barnstable. They're in Sandwich. Those graves are in Sandwich. Because he removed to Sandwich. I think possibly by the time I'm seeing you in 69, he's removed to Sandwich, but I'm not sure. But it's around that time, at least they list him as a resident of Sandwich. He's definitely removed when he marries Bourne. He definitely is there then, but he's listed as a resident now.
So, Sandwich where, and Chipman Road in Sandwich, does that have anything to do with directly?
I would assume it does. Yes.
Right next to Pearl Fire.
And I couldn't find exactly where in Sandwich. My grandparents lived in Sandwich. My aunt lived in Sandwich, and I couldn't find out exactly where because I really need to go into the church records. That's where I think we can find that stuff out. And I tried to access them online, but it's hard to access them online. So it's a good question where in Sandwich. I don't know. Maybe I should come back and answer all these questions.
What did you die?
They don't say. They often don't say. They don't have names for diseases. They will say sometimes if someone dies in childbirth, and things that we have names for now had different names, like puerperal fever was childbed fever. So there are some things that we know what they were back in time and what they are now. But other times they just describe how someone died. Like He was bleeding at the nose when he died. And that is a sure sign of death, according to the natives, or something like that. They'll describe things, or what state they were in. And they describe cures by their standards. So if someone's not doing well and they give them a purgative, they'll list how many bowel movements and how many pukes they had and how big they were, because that is a good remedy, right? I think that was happening a long time, because I worked in a nursing home when I was younger, and this guy used to tell me, good results. He'd tell me how many he had, good results. And that's what they say in the records, good results. So it's tricky. And it's, it certainly is the age of reason philosophically, but people are still catching up. The common people are still catching up. So you're still folk remedies and things like lungwort, because lungwort's leaf looks like a diseased lung. You're still doing those kinds of treatments. There are opposite treatments and there are similar treatments. So there are similar treatments, for instance, something that's yellow treats jaundice. But then there are also opposite treatments where if you have a cold, you need to get something hot and dry into you to balance you back out, because there's still this sense that your body is balanced between these four humors. So it's really a neat time. And I didn't wear a head covering because I looked at a lot of paintings from this time period, and there are women who have paintings with both a head covering and not a head covering. And there are lots of women with paintings without head coverings. We own a lot of land, and I think I'm a head of a house, probably with a number of servants. So, and I also thought it would be interesting to see me in something other than the coif. So this is a style that they're actually complaining about, Puritans are complaining about, where they curl the front band of their hair, so they have their hair back, but they've curled the front band of their hair. If I had really, they would cut their hair short and let it really curl. So I just did that a little bit, just to give you the idea of it. But they're complaining about women who have boning in their, in this bit. And so the bone kind of sticks out like that. They think that's terrible. And silk hoods, people are wearing silk hoods. It's terrible. So that's the choice that I made today, but we really don't know a lot about the 1670s. People didn't really have portraits done a lot until the 1700s, and by then they're not wearing hair coverings. So I chose to go this way, and this is a style of clothing that is accurate to the time. We only had one of these, so it's good. So I tried to show you as much as I could of what her time would have looked like. We don't know a lot. It's the thing about 1620 to 1630 is William Bradford wrote so much. He wrote so many stories. There's so much information about them. In this time period, it's a puzzle. You just keep pulling pieces in. You know better than anybody, right? So you have a plaque on the Chipman house now, don't you? Some of you were there for that? So that's wonderful, yes. And we can still see at the Sturgis Library, we can see that original church. I think, isn't that where Lothrop's church is, Sturgis Library? That's the first church. And then they did move. They did move to another church, and then they split parishes, and that's when this was built, and another church was built in the West Parish. So that church that they were at, that I'm talking about, wasn't there for very long, Meetinghouse. They eventually split parishes, and then they I think where the UU church is now is where the third church was, but I'm not sure. Yeah, that's right? Okay.
There's a stone on the fifth day.
Is there?
That marks where it was.
So that's another thing about this congregational tradition. Oh yes, but that makes sense. The congregational tradition went a lot of directions. Sometimes it went Presbyterian, sometimes it went UU, sometimes it went congregational. So you can't always tell. It's kind of fun to talk to church groups because a lot of church groups have their foundation in this faith. So it's sort of fun to tell each church group where they came from.
Relative to the Anglican Church, talking about the theology.
Oh, so the Anglican Church, okay, a little history. The European Reformation. It was very exciting. People like Martin Luther were writing letters and essays, and people all over Europe were reading them. All different people, women and gentlewomen and working men and noblemen. He wrote for everybody, and everybody was getting on fire about this idea of Reformation. In England, King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. The Pope said that would be stupid because, she's related to the Holy Roman Emperor. I'm not, do I look dumb? No, you can't divorce her. So he says, fine, we're not Catholic anymore, we're Protestant. So people literally went to bed Catholic and woke up Protestant, and that is not a thought reformation, that's a political reformation, right? So what happens is the church retains a lot of the characteristics of the Catholic Church. So it reduces the number of sacraments. The Catholic Church had a whole slew of them, and the church kept baptism and communion, I think, is all that the Church of England kept. And the Church of England is still a Calvin-based Protestant church, but it's very high church. So when Henry VIII died, his boy went on the throne, Edward, and there was a protectorate in charge while he was on the throne, and that's when the Book of Common Prayer was written. And that is essentially the same now as it was when Edward wrote it. It's a little bit updated, but that is the same thing. So their concept was, there was a prayer book that everyone used, so the prayers were written down. They were even writing sermons and sending them to the pastors. So pastors were reading sermons right out of whatever was sent to them by the king. So, and Elizabeth, so then Mary's on the throne, and Mary makes everyone Catholic again, Bloody Mary. Then after her death, Elizabeth is on the throne, and she's kind of the tolerant one, although she killed a lot of people. Don't let anyone fool you. They didn't call her Bloody Elizabeth, but she was no angel. But she's on the throne, and she's the one who says, okay, she's pretty tolerant, but she does say this is what the church is. She passes a few laws of uniformity and defining what the church is and what all the churches should be doing the same. And she also, in that, retained apostolic succession. I know I sound like a dork, but so Catholics believe that St. Peter was the first pope, and then every pope after him was blessed by someone in that line. That's apostolic succession. All popes and everyone really has been blessed by one of the popes. So all the clergy have apostolic succession. It goes back to an apostle. She retained it. She kept all of the people who are high up in the church were people who had already been put in there under apostolic succession. It's so smart because it just keeps everybody hooked in who might have a question. You know what I mean? Anyone who was feeling like they were more Catholic, they at least had this apostolic succession that was retained. So smart of her. So the church is essentially the same. And what people started doing is after Elizabeth came on the throne, people came back after they had translated the Bible, and they were reading the Bible and figuring out, whoa, none of this comes from the Bible. There's nothing. The Bible says pray, read the Bible, and preach from the heart. There's nothing in there that says write down something so everyone preaches the same thing. They wanted more Holy Spirit. Not as much as the Quakers, but they wanted more Holy Spirit in what they were doing. You know what I mean? So that was the big Reformation in England, was really when people said, whoa, the Bible doesn't say this at all. We can do what the Bible says because we can read it. Let's do it. You know, it was really neat, actually. I'm not excited by that at all. I know it's 8 o'clock. Thank you for coming. I'll stay and answer questions. Thank you for coming out on this sticky night.